Well, the world is running out of babies. For most of modern history, we worried about the world having too many people competing for food, housing, jobs, energy, and resources. But something remarkable is happening across the world. People are having fewer children. In China, Japan, South Korea, and across much of Europe, birth rates have fallen dramatically. And the problem isn't simply that these countries may eventually have fewer people. It's that those countries are getting older. Fewer children today means fewer workers tomorrow. And fewer workers means fewer taxpayers supporting a growing number of retirees. It means fewer people starting businesses, buying homes, joining militaries, and producing the goods and services an economy needs. Hey, a quick favor. I'm trying to get this channel to 5,000 subscribers as quick as possible. If you could hit that like and subscribe, I'd really appreciate it. While some of the world's wealthiest and most powerful countries are getting older, other parts of the world remain remarkably young. And that could reshape everything from immigration and economic growth to military power and the balance of power between nations. For decades, we worried about a world with too many people. But one of the defining geopolitical questions of this century may be exactly the opposite. What happens when the world's most powerful countries start running out of people? So let's start with, why do people stop having children? Well, there isn't really one simple answer to that. For most of the human history, having a large family made economic sense. Children worked on farms, helped support the household, and eventually helped take care of their parents as they got older. But as countries became wealthier, that equation changed. People moved from farms into cities. Children went from being part of the household workforce to becoming increasingly expensive to raise. Housing became more expensive. Education lasted longer. People married later. Women gained greater access to education and careers. Independence. Birth control became widely available. And as infant mortality declined, parents no longer needed to have 5 or 6 children to be reasonably certain that several would survive into adulthood. Put all those changes together and something happened almost everywhere. Countries became wealthier and more urbanized. Families got smaller. At first, that's not necessarily a problem. In fact, it can be a sign of tremendous economic and social progress. But eventually, some countries crossed another threshold. They didn't just fall below the large families of the past. They fell below replacement level. That's roughly the number of children each woman needs to have, on average, for one generation to replace itself without immigration. And once birth rates remain below that level long enough, the mathematics become difficult to escape. A smaller generation of children grows up to become a smaller generation of adults. And now that smaller generation has to produce enough children to replace not only itself, but an enormous generation that came before it. That's the demographic trap countries like Japan, China, South Korea, Italy, and others are confronting today. And their governments, they've noticed. Countries have offered cash payments, subsidized child care, parental leave, housing assistance, tax breaks, and other incentives trying to convince people to have more children. But there's a problem. Once people decide they want smaller families, governments have discovered that changing their minds can be incredibly difficult. Which raises the next question. What happens to a country when the number of young people keeps shrinking, but the number of old people keeps growing? So what does an aging country actually look like? At first, probably not that different. The roads still work, factories still operate, the restaurants are still open and generally full. But underneath the surface, the balance of population begins to change. There are fewer children entering schools, fewer young adults entering the workforce, and more people leaving the workforce and entering retirement. Eventually, schools began closing because there aren't enough students. Businesses struggle to find workers. Rural communities shrink as younger people move toward the cities. Healthcare systems face growing demand from an aging population. And governments have to support more retirees with a smaller number of taxpayers. That's when demographics stop being simply about population. They become an economic problem. A country can build another factory. It can build another highway. Hell, it can build another power plant. But creating another generation of 25-year-old workers, that takes about 25 years. And that makes demographics different from almost every other economic problem governments face. You can't fix it quickly, but the consequences go beyond economics. Young people don't just become workers. They become engineers, entrepreneurs, doctors, construction workers, taxpayers, and soldiers. A country with fewer young people eventually has fewer people available to serve in its military at exactly the same time that more of its resources may have to be devoted to pensions, healthcare, and caring for an aging population. That's where this becomes a geopolitical problem, because countries don't age at the same time. While Japan, South Korea, and China, and much of Europe are getting older, other parts of the world still have enormous young populations. India, parts of Southeast Asia, and especially Africa, over the next several decades, some countries will be trying to figure out what to do with too few young workers, while others will be trying to create enough jobs for millions of them. And that creates one of the strangest contradictions of the 21st century. The countries that need young workers the most may increasingly be the countries where fewer young people are being born, while many of the countries producing the most young workers may not have enough jobs for them. And there's really only one obvious way to connect the two: migration. So can migration solve the problem? At least economically, part of the answer seems obvious. If your country doesn't have enough young workers, bring in workers from other countries. And unlike waiting 25 years for another generation to grow up, immigration can change the workforce almost immediately. A 25-year-old immigrant arrives already capable of working. They can pay taxes, start businesses, buy homes, and have children. And then they contribute immediately to an economy that desperately needs them. That's one reason immigration has become so important across many developed countries. But there's a problem. What makes sense economically doesn't always work politically. Large-scale immigration can put pressure on housing, schools, transportation, and public services. It can create challenges around language and integration. And when migration happens too quickly, or governments appear to lose control of their borders, political resistance can grow rapidly. We've already seen that across Europe, and this creates a remarkable contradiction. Many wealthy countries increasingly need immigrants economically, but politically, voters in many of those same countries are demanding less immigration. Governments are essentially being pulled in two directions at once. Businesses want workers, healthcare systems need workers, construction companies need workers, and governments need taxpayers. But voters also want secure borders, controlled immigration, and confidence that the people entering their country can actually be integrated successfully. And this is why demographics and immigration are becoming impossible to separate. Immigration can't completely solve population aging. Immigrants eventually grow old too. And bringing in millions of people without the housing, infrastructure, or political support to absorb them creates problems of its own. But for countries that are already far below replacement fertility, immigration may become one of the few tools capable of slowing the decline in their working age populations. Which means the immigration debate of the future may look very different from the one we're having today. The question may not simply be, how many immigrants should we allow in? It may increasingly become, how do aging countries compete for the young people they need while still maintaining control of their borders? Because the countries with young populations are going to possess something increasingly valuable: people. Who'd have known? So who wins in the aging world? For China, the challenge is enormous. China spent decades benefiting from a huge working age population that helped turn it into the manufacturing center of the world. But that demographic advantage is fading. China's population is aging, its workforce is shrinking, and there are far fewer children coming behind them. Japan and South Korea, they face similar problems. Hell, Europe does too. While India, it's in a very different position. India still has an enormous young population and can benefit from that workforce for decades. And Africa, hell, it may eventually become even more important. The continent is home to some of the youngest populations in the world. If African countries can create enough jobs, infrastructure, and education and economic growth for those young people, they could become an extraordinary advantage. If they can't, migration pressures could become even larger. And then there's the good old U.S. America is aging too. Americans aren't having enough children to completely escape the demographic pressures affecting other wealthy countries. But the United States has something many of its geopolitical competitors don't have to the same degree. People still want to move here, and we still have suburbs. For generations, America has been able to bring people from around the world into its economy. Workers, scientists, engineers, entrepreneurs, doctors, families, construction workers. Hell, you name it, we can bring them in. That doesn't mean unlimited immigration is the answer. A country still has to control its borders. It still has to decide who enters. And then it has to build enough housing and infrastructure to support those that have entered. That's not even to speak of integration. But if America can figure out how to do those things, immigration could become a major geopolitical advantages, because the competition of the future may not simply be about oil or technology or even military power. It may increasingly be about something much more basic. Who has enough young people to keep the entire system running? For most of our lives, we've been told to worry about a world with too many people. But the countries that succeed over the next century may be the ones that figure out what to do when there aren't enough. Hey, this is Frank with America's Geopolitics. Don't forget to like and subscribe. See you next time.